Okay, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. This is actually a re-recording of class which we did live yesterday. For some reason, didn't record. This is just a rerun. And we're going to today conclude our discussion about the nervous system and about the organization of the nervous system. And we saw last time that the nervous system is organized into two major divisions. That is the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and then all of the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves other than the central nervous system, which run through the whole of the rest of the body. And the peripheral nervous system, in turn, we recognize that there are nerves which run from the body to the central nervous system, carrying information, carrying sensory information, usually of one sort or another, which is then integrated in the central nervous system. So those nerves which run to the brain are called the afferent nerves. For those nerves which in the peripheral nervous system, which run from the brain out to the body and carry output from the central nervous system, are called the efferent neurons. And the efferent neurons are in turn divided into two types, and they are actually anatomically different to one another. The first type are the nerves which will result in actual motor response. In other words, those nerves which will produce skeletal movement under voluntary control. But a huge amount of output from the central nervous system is actually unconscious. It belongs to the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system which is not under voluntary control. And you'll realize that many of these functions are functions of homeostasis. The brain is assessing input from the body and is producing an output to the glands, smooth muscle, all sorts of parts of the body in order to maintain homeostasis. And the autonomic nervous system is in turn divided into the sympathetic nerve division, which we in general regard, it's not entirely true, but we in general regard it as being the activating part of the autonomic nervous system. When you get a fright and your heart starts to race and your blood pressure goes up and your mouth goes dry, all of these things are effects of output through the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic division is usually related to rest, relaxation, where ordinary housekeeping activities of the organism will take place. Feeding, digestion, sex, all of these kinds of activities tend to be regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are in opposition, do often act in opposition to one another, as we'll see, but they don't butt heads. Instead, they interlace and they move from a balance of one to a balance towards the other. It's not an all or nothing response. You don't either have sympathetic operating or parasympathetic operating. They both operate together. It just depends what the level of importance that one or the other division has at a particular time. There is a third division of the autonomic nervous system, and this is the Enteric Division. This is the part of the nervous system which governs activity of the gut, peristalsis, release of digestive enzymes, etc., from gut organs. All of these kinds of activities are governed by the Enteric Division. But the Enteric Division can be superseded by activity of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous divisions. They can exert control over the enteric. But in actual fact, under normal circumstances, it has a lot of autonomy in regulating gut activity. So the autonomic nervous system, just remember, it's going to be operating to govern the activity of involuntary muscle, heart muscle, gut muscle, all of these kind of smooth muscles. And then the glands, activity of glands, etc., etc. And remember that the activity of those glands may themselves have very profound effects. And if you want to think about that, just think about what happens when you have a fright. When you get a fright, is in fact a signal from your hypothalamus to your adrenal gland, which produces, through the autonomic nervous system, which produces the epinephrine and norepinephrine, the adrenalins, which get your heart racing, get your blood pressure up. So we won't do this in an enormous amount of detail, but I will just show you a couple of things. First of all, I said that there is actually an anatomical difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The enteric system is not shown here. There are two major differences between the two. The first is that most of the parasympathetic originates here in this portion of the brain, and that is the brain stem. And the nerves are very long, and they run all the way out to the various parts of the body. This shows only the trunk, but in actual fact, the parasympathetic nervous system runs to various parts of the body. There's one part of the parasympathetic nervous system which does pass through the spine, and it regulates emptying of the bladder and the genitals as well, activity of the genitals, like erection, that kind of thing. The other anatomical difference to notice is that they have little ganglia associated close to the organ or the muscles or whatever where they're going to operate. When we look at the sympathetic nervous system, we see that most of the sympathetic nerves, although they originate in the brain, many of them originate in the brain stem as well, or in this central part of the brain. Most of the sympathetic nerves run through the spine and then exit as spinal nerves. So, and they have a complex set of ganglia called the sympathetic ganglia, lie close to the spine, that they pass through before they go off to their destinations. So that's just two of the anatomical differences. Have a look at this and see where the targets are and what their activity is. Read through all of these. I'm not going to cover them now, all of them now. I'm just going to hit on a couple of them. And for example, have a look here. This parasympathetic nerve actually acts on the pupil of the eye, and it allows the pupil of the eye to constrict. Now, it doesn't cause that constriction. It allows the constriction to occur if there is bright light. Okay, so under normal circumstances, your eye responds normally to the amount of light, opens and shuts. The sympathetic division, on the other hand, forces a dilation. It forces dilation of the eye because this is the alert. This is the alert response. When an organism is in fight or flight response, it is governed by the sympathetic division largely. And think about the eye. You want the eye to be receiving as much light as possible, even if it's dim. Yeah, you want as much as possible. Second of all, just think of a personal situation where you are stressed or where you're frightened or anxious, right? One of the things that happens, your mouth goes dry. And that is because of the sympathetic nervous system operating through the spine all the way back up to your salivary glands, inhibits your salivary glands. Your mouth goes dry. Salivary gland saliva production is a process of digestion. It can wait. Digestion can wait until you are safe and you have no stress and everything, then digestion can proceed. You don't want digestion running while you are busy running. You don't want digestion using up energy, which should go to your muscles to get you to succeed in your fight or to succeed in your flight. Okay, so that is the way to think about it. But also remember that we can control the amount, the body can control the amount of saliva that it produces as it needs it by balancing the sympathetic and parasympathetic input. It's not that this gets shut off entirely, or that this gets shut off entirely when you're relaxing. It's that the balance sways one way or the other. Look at all of the things that the sympathetic rather tends to do, and you'll see that most of them you can work out logically. Just think what happens when you get a fright. When any organism gets a fright, your bronchi expand so that you can get lots of oxygen. The heartbeat accelerates so that you can pump lots of blood to your muscles. You stop all the activities that you don't need. You stop digestion, etc., etc., etc. You stimulate glucose release. All of these things are to provide you with lots and lots of energy. At the bottom here, there are some confusions. And I won't go into all of the ways in which they interact, but I'll just tell you that for all of these, these parasympathetic functions here and these sympathetic functions, their interaction is extremely complex. As soon as you get to the pelvic area, their interaction is extremely complex. And I'll point out two things for you. The first thing is, have a look here, and it says here that the sympathetic division inhibits emptying of the bladder. Okay, so right. Under normal circumstances, that is true. And the parasympathetic division promotes the emptying of the bladder well. Just think about if people are very, very frightened, what do? They often pee themselves or they poop themselves. Their bowels empty. It's the same thing. The parasympathetic also promotes evacuation of the bowels. The sympathetic inhibits. Well, what's going on? In actual fact, in this instance here, there is a swap over. And when people are extremely frightened, or when an organism is extremely frightened, they will very frequently urinate and defecate. Why? Because they want to get rid of all of that weight. They're going to run. They're going to run or they're going to fight. They don't want to be carrying all of that weight around with them. And in this instance, in fact, under strong stimulation, under strong fear stimulation, the parasympathetic nervous system causes the bowels and the bladder to empty. It also becomes very complicated during sex, because most sexual activity, the performance of sex leading up to sex, leading to insertion, stimulation of the genitals, etc., etc. The production of an erection, for example, in male or arousal in a female is a parasympathetic activity. But ejaculation and orgasm are a sympathetic activity. During sex, there is a long, long period of when this parasympathetic division operates, and under stimulation, it gradually moves up to a point where suddenly it swaps over. And suddenly the parasympathetic stops operating and the sympathetic comes in order to cause orgasm, ejaculation in the male. So if you think about the sexual problems that people have, they often are related to mix-ups between their sympathetic activity and parasympathetic activity. People get very concerned about having sex, what is going to happen? Well, they're going to inhibit arousal. They're going to drive sympathetic activity and inhibit arousal. That's the kind of thing that can happen. It's not irreversible, but that is the sort of thing that can happen. Okay, so let's have a look also at the organization of the brain itself, because the brain, for us, Woody Allen always just says brain is his second favorite organ. And for us, of course, our brain is really relatively large compared to the size of our bodies and performs a huge number of functions. But in all vertebrates, there is a basic kind of organization. Ours is simply an elaboration on a basic structure, which we can see in most vertebrates. And remember that the brain is processing. And in order to process, the areas of the brain talk to one another. When I talk about certain activities being in certain areas, think about it as being predominantly in that area, but that area must be talking to all of the rest of the brain in order for the function to work properly. Now, we can see how the brain becomes structured when we look at the embryo, but its basic form is of an elaborate tube. Here's a CT scan. This is the cerebrum here, one of the cerebral hemispheres there. Here is the midbrain here, and here is the hind brain here, together with the cerebellum. That's the hind brain. And this is a tube, and it comes up as a tube, and the brain is an elaborate tube which is reflected back on itself, and then the walls of the tube are enormously expanded. But you'll see in the center here, there are the cerebral ventricles, that we talked about before. So here is the cerebral ventricle, which extends through the brain as a space filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Surrounding it communicates with this space around the brain, which is membrane bound, which is also filled with fluid. The brain effectively floats in the skull. This is a human, and the cerebral hemispheres are very large and convoluted and folded. But it's actually, we're going to see, it's the outside of the cerebral hemispheres that we are going to be particularly interested in. Okay, so let's look at the embryo, and then see how the embryo is nervous system is structured, and see how that is elaborated to produce the final product in the adults. Here's a very young embryo, and you can clearly see that this is a tube. You imagine this is all hollow all the way through to here. And the front part there is called the forebrain. This is the midbrain, and this is the hind brain here. But it's actually this forebrain here that we are going to be particularly interested in, because that's what is going to develop into the cerebral hemispheres. It's going to become enormously elaborated. This is a bit later on in fetal development. And get some of these names. I don't expect you to remember them all, but get some of them clear in your head. So this is the Teal Encephalon. Its part here, there, that part there, it is the Teal Encephalon is that part of the forebrain which is going to elaborate into the cerebral hemispheres. Have a look here, and you can see this. It's the same color coded to show you there. That's the Teal Encephalon forming the cerebrum. This is called the Diencephalon. It is part originally of the forebrain, but it comes to lie in the center here of the brain. And this is a part of the brain which people colloquially refer to as the lizard brain, which we keep as this primitive brain, relatively primitive brain structure integrated into our own brain. So this is a diencephalon. And the names to remember, some of them you've heard, the thalamus and the hypothalamus are the two things to remember from there. The hypothalamus, we talked about when we talked about glands and everything, where we saw the hypothalamus and pituitary functioning together, for instance, to govern endocrine function throughout the body. The thalamus is something we have not heard a lot about, but the thalamus is tremendously important, and for all sorts of reasons. But one of the main things about it is that it's a routing system. It is the thalamus which shunts information to the correct areas of the brain in order for them to be processed. Processing does take place in this diencephalon, but it does not result in any conscious output. That is the responsibility of the cerebrum. This is here. Just remember this, all of this here, the mesencephalon. Just remember this as the midbrain, and here it is here. So we've got, there's Teal Encephalon there. Here's diencephalon there. Here is the midbrain there. And there are many autonomic functions associated with the midbrain. The midbrain forms part, joins rather, to this whole section here. From where the spine starts at the exit of the skull up to the midbrain is called the hind brain. And it is divided into these parts, the pons, the cerebellum there, and then the medulla oblongata there. And when you think back, have a look, let's just go back a minute. Have a look here. Look where so many of our parasympathetic functions arise there, but sympathetic functions do as well. It's just that they run through the spine. So many of these autonomic functions are governed here, all sorts of things. It does operate in conjunction with other parts of the brain, with the hypothalamus, for example, but various things like sleep, for example, blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate. All of these things are governed by this part, this is the midbrain and the hindbrain, with some involvement of the midbrain in the functions as well. This is one of the reasons why people suffer traumatic brain injury and they lose cerebral function entirely. They can carry on living. They carry on living because many of the functions of the body are governed by this mid and hind brain. And if the mid and hind brain are preserved sufficiently, then many of the functions, heartbeat, breathing, all of these sort of things will carry on, come in complete absence of any cerebral function at all. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this part, especially the diencephalon, and shown here the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus that we heard about when we talked about endocrine function. The hypothalamus is actually part of the brain. It is actually neural tissue. It's a lot of it is neurosecretory tissue, but there's a lot of sensory function to the hypothalamus as well. And it interacts with the pituitary gland, but the pituitary gland is not truly part of the nervous system. It arises from another origin. Here is the brain stem, which consists of the midbrain, pons, the medulla oblongata, and then associated with it as part of the hindbrain is the cerebellum there. The cerebellum is responsible very largely for governing our sense of space, of our orientation and posture and balance. So the cerebellum is very strongly associated with movement and with maintaining our position in space. we have sense, in actual fact, of where we are in space, which is routed to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum receives all of the information, for example, from the balancing organs in the ear, and performs very rapid adjustments to our posture and everything to enable us to walk. Walking is a strange thing. Walking is actually a sort of falling. It's controlled falling. Every time you take a step forward, you actually fall. And the cerebellum is responsible for catching you by putting your foot down to take your next step. People who have cerebellar damage or cerebellar tumors lose the ability to locomote properly. Their locomotion becomes disorganized. So the first thing to ask you is just to take a second to realize that you are indeed awake, as I hope that you are, because being awake is a very interesting thing. We tend to divide our lives into two parts. We say that we're awake or we're asleep, right? And if you ask somebody what is the characteristic of being asleep, they will say, well, it's being unconscious. Well, that is absolutely not true. By unconscious, we mean that we are not aware of sensory input, right? That is not true when you sleep. You are still aware of sensory input. That's why you wake up if something happens around you that might be dangerous. It's been shown time and again, you can provide sensory input to people who are sleeping, and they do indeed respond. Sometimes people will respond to sensory input by dreaming. Dreaming is a form of consciousness. We are clearly awake when we clearly have a level of consciousness, when we are asleep. And if we measure brain waves, we realize that the brain is extremely active when we're asleep. It's just that it's a different kind of activity to when we are awake and aware of what is happening around us. This is a profound thing. Sleep is an essential physiological requirement, just as much as water or food. And it is very carefully governed by the brain. And here's one of the parts of the brain which is really responsible for determining whether we're asleep or whether we're awake. And it's a set of nerves in the brain stem here. And it's called the Reticular Formation because they interlace with one another all the way through and then feed out to the rest of the brain. And it is the reticular formation which governs whether we are awake or whether we are asleep. It's that area which switches us from one state of consciousness to another. Sleep is a very, very interesting thing. We can't discuss it at length, but I will just tell you one thing, and I'll repeat it when we talk a little bit about memory later on. And that is to tell you that that sleep is one of the functions of the body, which appears to be very good, very necessary for neural hygiene and also for formation and consolidation of memory. So we want to talk also about the central part of the brain, which is this ancient kind of part of the brain, which we call the Diencephalon, but it has many parts and it has some very, very powerful effects on the body. The names to remember are the amygdala, hippocampus, and then the thalamus itself. And one of the reasons that we are so interested in it is it appears to have two major responsibilities. The first being the generation of memory, and the second is that it's very powerfully involved in emotions, but it is not a deliberative area. It is the site of generation of emotion in its pure form. It is in this area that things like anger, love, lust, hunger, all of these things are associated with activity here, especially in the amygdala and the thalamus. We group them all together as the limbic system. And the limbic system seems to be very important in all sorts of things. First of all, like in motivation, and it has strong behavioral input. But what is happening is that the limbic system provides the basic drive. And that drive is then modified. It is modified, or it ought to be modified, by cerebral function. When it is not adequately managed by cerebral function, we get dysfunctions. And this is where things like addiction, violent behavior, these kind of things, uncontrollable violent behavior rather, uncontrollable anger. This is when we switched to pure limbic output without allowing the cerebral function to modify and modulate what the limbic system does. This is the area that we're talking about. This is the amygdala. You'll see it's organized. These are called nuclei, and they interact very closely with this part of the limbic system called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an area which decides on the nature of memory. That is one of its functions. It has other functions as well. And it is the hippocampus that decides, for example, whether the memory is to be short-term or long-term. And it appears to be during sleep that the hippocampal decisions are actually operated on, and short-term memory is cleared out, and long-term memory is stored elsewhere in the brain. You'll also see, very interestingly, this association with the olfactory system. Now, if you look at primitive vertebrates, like more primitive vertebrates, like a fish or a lizard or something like that, their olfactory senses are enormously well developed and actually form quite a large part of the brain. Ours do not. But there is still a strong association between the olfaction and this limbic system, which is very interesting. And the sense of smell has been demonstrated to have powerful effects on recall, for example, of memory, and on generation of emotion by association. And you may have noticed this, that if you smell something, you don't quite know where the smell is coming from, but it suddenly, you have in your mind a memory, or you suddenly place back again in a situation where that smell was important. So just remember that there is this strong interaction between the limbic system and the rest of the brain. Storage of emotional memory appears to be the responsibility of the amygdala. And so amygdalal function is really important in psychology, for example. And we're very interested in the way in which the amygdala functions in the storage of emotion associated with particular events. So now we need to talk, of course, about the cerebral cortex, which is this major part of our brain. And the cerebrum is responsible for our sense of awareness, our sense of consciousness, our sense of self and self of being, but it's also responsible for language and for cognition, for abstract thinking. And it is within the cerebrum that memory is stored. The decision about what is stored and where it is stored is made by the limbic system, but it is effectively stored in the cerebrum. And we recognize 4 different lobes that have particular function. Before we do so, I just want to introduce you to this gentleman. This is Phineas Gage. Now, right until the 18th century, the function of the brain was really poorly understood. For example, many people, even medical doctors, firmly believed that the brain was mainly involved in muscle movement and things like that, that emotion lay here in the heart, and that our sense of self was associated with just an innate presence of a soul, basically, that our consciousness, our soul were basically the same thing, operating in this mechanism driven by a brain, which we called the body. The association of areas of the brain with particular functions was not clear. But it was this kind of, it's not the only instance, but it was this kind of activity that led to our knowledge about brain function. Phineas Gage was he's a rather good looking, very, very religious, very pleasant chap in the late 18th century. And he worked on the railways. And he was what was called a tamper. The tampers were people, they would, when they wanted to blast rock, they would drill a hole in the rock. And the tamper would put dynamite down it and would then pack wadding on top of the dynamite to turn it into like a little bomb at the bottom of the hole, so that when it was lit, it exploded and blasted the rock apart. To push the dynamite wadding and everything down, they used this rod called a tamping rod. And Phineas Gage was busy doing this one day, and something went wrong, and the dynamite exploded while he was still standing over the hole, and it blasted the tamping rod right through his skull. It caused massive damage to his skull, went in underneath his eye, took out his eye, and came out at the top. They assumed that he would die, but he was fully conscious. And they carried him home, where they removed the rod. He then had a period of intense illness. He did become unconscious, but largely because he suffered massive brain infection. And they were basically just waiting for him to die, but he actually recovered. He did lose that eye, but otherwise, apart from it, he had a good head of hair to cover up the scar in his skull. But he underwent a complete personality change. He became a foul-mouthed, lusty, hard drinker. He abandoned his religion and became an extremely difficult character, angry, and he was always fighting. He underwent a total personality change. His physical disabilities were minimal. And this really surprised the doctors, because they thought that the major effect of such a brain injury would be a physical disability. It wasn't. He underwent a personality change. And that is because this bar went through the front part of his brain, which is where personality lies. And this is one of the ways in which they came to realize this. Phineas Gage went, by the way, I should tell you, Phineas Gage went on. This did not persist. It took a long time for him, but he actually largely recovered. He emigrated to Argentina, where he became a stagecoach driver. He worked for a mail service and was a stagecoach driver, and settled down. I don't know if he married or whatever, but he lived a reasonably long life. And many of the early personality changes, they didn't disappear, but they became modified so that he was able to lead a relatively normal life. So here, for example, we see the area where Phineas Gage was damaged. And that is right here. Let me just check. Give me 1 second. I just want to check something. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I just want to really want to check whether or not. Oh, no. I really want to check whether I'm recording. Yes, okay. Sorry for that. I'm just paranoid about the fact that it failed to record yesterday. I want to check if I am in fact recording. Okay, let's go back. So This is the area here where Phineas Gage was damaged, is this frontal area here. And look, that is called the prefrontal cortex. And it is the part of the brain which is involved with decision-making, planning, but also perception and perception of self and all sorts of functions like that. It is in that prefrontal cortex that a lot of the things which make us feel human lie. If we damage that, then we see changes in personality. And so this is the prefrontal cortex. Now, this word cortex is important because that tells you it's the outside layer of the brain. It's that gray matter on the outside of the brain. The cortex is where all the cell bodies of the neurons lie and all of the interneurons. And that implies that this is an area where there's a lot of interaction between the neurons. This is where a lot of the processing is taking place all through the brain. The 4 lobes that we need to remember, first of all, look at this one here. This is the temporal lobe there, and that lies at the side, and it always points forward like that. So that's a way to orient yourself on the brain. That's the temporal. Frontal lobe, that's this part here. This here is called the parietal lobe there. And this at the back is the occipital lobe. And there are certain specific functions associated with these lobes. The frontal lobe, we've discussed kind of the decision-making, et cetera, but at the back here of the frontal lobe is the area which most strongly controls motor movement. Any need for a motor movement is referred to this area here. This area here, the parietal lobe, is the area where all of our senses are integrated, arrive and are integrated. And all of the processing of that takes place in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe at the back here is where visual processing takes place. Remember, our eyes are here. The optic nerves run all the way back to here in order to for the visual input to be processed. The temporal lobe, its major importance, has several functions, but its major importance is its association with hearing. And this area here is called the auditory cortex, but we'll hear about another area here, which is also associated with hearing, but it's associated with hearing language. So there are even more in these lobes, there are even more refined areas which have much more specific function. So let's just have a look at those which are associated with hearing and speech and language, because it's really interesting. Here, for example, this is an analysis called a PET scan, a PET scan. PET scanning looks at activity of specific areas of the brain as it is happening. So this is somebody who's hearing words. So when you hear words, that the input from your ears has to be analyzed somehow. It has to be processed and analyzed. And just when you're just hearing, it is this area here. It's the auditory cortex, which is doing the processing of the incoming sound from the ears. But it is immediately referred to other areas of the brain. And you'll see in here that this area here, the Broca's area, Wernicke's area here, is where comprehension of sound takes place, especially comprehension of language, but comprehension of sound. I've got a sound, right? I've got to know, first of all, it's a sound, and second of all, I've got to know what kind of sound it is, so that I can refer that out to the rest of the brain. That is the responsibility of Wernicke's area, and you can see it lighting up here. If I ask somebody to read words, well, that is a visual process. So they come back here to the visual cortex. But the visual cortex doesn't provide necessarily understanding of what it is seeing. Instead, that has to be referred out to the other areas of the brain. If I ask somebody to read words, just to speak them, just to speak, then These are the areas here. First of all, this area here called Broca's area, which is responsible for our ability to form speech, and to form speech from something really abstract, which is words that we are hearing in our own heads. We then form them into speech and speak them out so that other people can understand them. But that requires really, really fine motor skill, and that motor skill lies here in this motor area of the frontal lobe. And so that's why we see here's Broca's area lighting up, and here's the motor area here lighting up as somebody speaks. If I say to you, what does a hen lay? What do birds lay? And you think to yourself, an egg. That is a completely different process. That is a completely different associative process. And look, another entirely different area of the frontal lobe opens up, may well be associated with language and things like this, but it is a special area where we generate the words that we use to describe things. Now, one of the things to understand is when we look at the brain, we look at the top of the brain, you'll realize that the cerebrum is actually divided into two halves. The whole brain basically is divided into two halves, but it's very clear in the cerebrum. It's divided into a left and a right half. And this is reflected in the functions of the different sides of the brain. I don't want to overemphasize this because there's been a lot of nonsense talked about left brain and right brain function. In fact, the two halves of the brain operate together. It's just that certain functions appear to be swayed to one side of the brain or the other. But there's tremendous amount of variability, and there's also a tremendous amount of plasticity about it. But in general, the left-hand hemisphere is the side which deals with, really, I would say, with hard fact. It is in the left-hand side that our ability to learn language and generate language, for example, lies. It's there that is more strongly associated with mathematical processing, logic systems, and processing of serial sequence, serial patterns, like in a patterns of numbers or whatever. It is the left-hand side in most people. The right-hand side is more associated with non-verbal thinking, emotional processing, that sort of thing. And also, it is often referred to as the artistic side because it's in the right-hand side that we recognize patterns in nature, like visual patterns, color patterns, all of this sort of thing. So, but I want to emphasize that there's a huge amount of interaction between the two halves. That lateralization is also linked to handedness, to whether people are left-handed or right-handed. And indeed, in left-handed people, it tends to sway the other way. Their brain, the left hand functions as most other people's right-hand brain functions. They communicate with one another through a huge collection of nerve fibers which run through horizontally through the brain, connect the two hemispheres, called the corpus callosum. So I'm not going to go through all of the things that can happen if we damage the brain, but here are some of them which you can read through on your own, and realize that much of our understanding of the brain has arisen from people who have suffered brain damage, lesions to different areas of the brain, or else brain tumors or strokes or other trauma to the brain. And when that is localized to a small area and they suffer a specific deficit, we can begin to associate the function with a particular area. So injuries to the left-hand side of the brain, as we would expect, we would start to have difficulties with understanding spoken and written language, difficulty with systems of logic, etc., etc. Damage to the right-hand side of the brain is strongly associated with memory loss, memory issues, and deficits or profound changes in creative ability, that sort of thing. Anyway, read through these on your own and just have a look at these functions, which are extremely interesting. And I will just point you to this wonderful book if you are interested. Oliver Sacks was a neurologist many of you may have heard of, and he worked particularly on the frontal lobes, which are the areas of logic, reasoning, personality. A huge number of human functions take place there, and deficits in the frontal lobes produce some bizarre results. And he wrote this wonderful book, one of his first books, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which points to a real incident. He interviewed a gentleman and his wife. The gentleman was suffering progressive difficulties, almost like dementia, but he was perfectly able to conduct conversations, was aware of where he was, etc., etc., etc. But when they got up to leave, he had hung his hat on a hat stand. And when he got to the hat stand, he hesitated for a minute, and then he turned around and picked up his wife. He grabbed his wife, tried to pick her up and put her on his head. Why? Right up until he gets up to the hat stand, he knows he's leaving. He needs to put his hat on. He gets to the hat stand and realizes, I need a hat. He looks around and he is unable to distinguish which of the objects in front of him is actually a hat. He's able to get all the way up to that. Now he needs to recognize an object as being something with a specific purpose. He can't do it because he unfortunately had a tumorous lesion in the frontal lobe of his brain, which meant that he had lost that ability. He mistook his wife for a hat. Anyway, you can read this. It's a very, very, very good book. Okay, so the cerebral cortex now receives all of the sensory information from all over the body, and it assesses all of this information and is really the responsibility of that central part of the brain, the thalamus, which directs the sensory input to the correct areas. When we believe, for example, that when we take hallucinatory substances, LSD or mushrooms or whatever, this is one of the things that gets very much affected, is the thalamus's ability to shunt sensory information to the correct places. And this is one of the reasons you begin seeing colors when you hear music, or you have hallucinations, etc., because sensory input is shunted to the wrong place. So where there are specific areas of the brain which are also associated with specific areas of the body. And first of all, look just at the motor area here of the frontal lobe there. And it's organized in the same way as in similar way to where the body is organized, so that adjacent body parts provides neural information to one another in this integrated area here. And just have a look here and you'll see this is the motor area here, hips, trunk here, arms. So you can imagine it's running, your brain sees from your legs all the way up to here in continuous band. Then there's a whole dedicated area here to the face and to the tongue. Why should this be? Well, because the muscles of the face have to perform so many different functions. First of all, eating in itself is a complex activity. Second of all, speech is a very complex activity, very, very complex. And thirdly, because the muscles of the face, especially in primates, are also used for communication. And quite unconsciously, we move our muscles in specific ways which convey information, and especially emotional information, to other people. You may decide to smile, but if you don't do it properly, it doesn't look like a real smile, okay? And that is because human beings are exquisitely sensitive to facial expression and to the changes in small muscles. That's one of the reasons so much of the motor areas are devoted to the face. In terms of sensation, have a look at it's the same kind of organization, all the way feet, all the way to the fingers, but look how much is dedicated to the arm. Sensory information is coming in from the arm and from the hand. Why? These are our major sensory inputs in terms of touch, heat, pressure, etc., etc. The face as well. This is also extremely sensitive. We receive a huge amount of information, which needs to be relayed to the brain. So there's and you can see that there are very sensitive areas: the teeth, gums, jaw, tongue, and the pharynx, because functions like speaking, but also eating, require very, very careful control, and need to be providing sensory feedback the whole time to work properly. Okay, so it's wrong to think of the brain as being something which is just fixed. It always used to be said nowadays that you kept what you were born, the neurons you were born with or that developed soon after birth, were the ones you kept for your whole life, and that, you know, if you did things like smoke or drink or whatever, you killed neurons and they would never come back again. Well, this we now know is not true. That in fact the nervous system is in fact quite plastic. It can change, and that there are in fact neuronal stem cells in the nervous system, which can continually form new nerves if need be, and also that modifications to existing nerves can occur. And these occur in various ways that are extremely complex. I'm only going to very briefly refer to them. I just want you to be aware of the fact that far from the old idea being true, nerves in fact can be changed and modified, and the whole nervous system can be modified as well. There are two major changes that can occur at a neuron, first of all. And the first is that we can change the signaling to a neuron that takes place from other neurons. We can change the synaptial structures that impinge on a neuron. The second thing that can be changed, which is probably even more important, is that we can change the receptor structures that are present in the cell membrane of neurons. Remember something. Our nerves produce many different neurotransmitters, but the function of that neurotransmitter depends upon the receptor that it binds to. And one neuroreceptor may bind to many different kinds of receptors. One neurotransmitter may produce many different effects depending on the receptor that it binds to. And this is one of the most important ways in which a neuronal function can be changed. A neuron can change its receptors under guidance of the rest of the nervous system. It can change its receptors. So changing the synaptial structure, here there are various ways it can be done. But one of the ways, if a nerve is continually stimulated, if it's continually receiving input from other nerves, it can, the system can actually increase the number of synapses that impinge on the nerve. Have a look here. We start off, we're strongly stimulating here. and this connection needs to be strengthened, or the function of this neuron needs now to be strengthened, and the surrounding neurons, under guidance, by the way, of the glial cells, will begin to form new neurons which impact on this nerve cell. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if two neurons have synapses to a nerve, and both are active, they actually can interact with one another. So if we have one synapse which is sending particularly strong frequent signals to the succeeding nerve here, and there's another synapse here, this synapse here can respond by strengthening, by strengthening the amount, for example, of neurotransmitter that it releases, something like that. There's a twist to the tale, because in actual fact, there are some neurons which are inhibitory, right? They are stimulatory and inhibitory neurons. And both, if a nerve cell is particularly active, you may have an increase in inhibitory neurons as well. And that is so that that neuron becomes more and more carefully controlled by the nervous system. So changing the nature of the synapses, that's one way of modification. But changing the second way in which the synapse can be changed is by changing the actual structures, the actual receptors that are present in the cell membrane. And this is believed to be one of the key features of the formation of memory. That memory, in part, consists of changing the actual cell membrane structures, and thus the function of a particular neuron under the influence of the rest of the nervous system. I've got to simplify it down so much that it actually becomes almost impossible to understand. If you are interested, go and read the section in your textbook, but it's too complex for us to discuss here. Let's just talk about memory for a second. I know I'm over time, but I want to get this section finished today. First of all, you're probably aware of the fact there are the fact that there are two kinds of memory. You may not be aware of the fact that there are actually three kinds of memory. So the memory forms that you're probably familiar with are short-term memory. It's familiar to all of us. We briefly remember something, we learn something, you're doing a quiz, and you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you study for an hour before your quiz, and you remember enough for your quiz, and then after the quiz, it's all gone. It's gone away. That is typical short-term memory. It's stuff which is useful to us for a brief period of time, but it is then dissipated and cannot be recalled. It has to be repeated. You have to learn again. You have to do it again in order to remember what has happened. So that is short-term memory. Long-term memory is memory which can be recalled after a considerable amount of time. The amount of time varies, and there's a lot of theory about the nature of long-term memory. Some people posit that most long-term memory can be recalled even from whenever it was laid down. It just becomes more and more difficult to pull it into consciousness. That it's somewhere there, but it just gets more and more difficult to pull into consciousness. The decision about whether stuff is short-term or long-term appears to be the responsibility of the hippocampus. And one of the things that also appears to be true is that the amygdala, the emotional part of the limbic system, is also involved. And that the hippocampus tends to put into long-term memory material that it thinks is important. And it thinks it will shunt stuff which appears to be have emotional content. Emotional content, I don't mean that it makes you cry or it makes you laugh. What I mean is information which carries with it a sense that this is important for some reason or another. And one of the ways you can trick your hippocampus into believing that is by repeating stuff. If you repeat stuff over and over again, whatever it is, an experience, what you are reading, what you're learning, whatever, the hippocampus comes to believe that if it's being repeated that often, it must be of particular importance and will shunt it into long-term memory. We also believe that this consolidation of memory takes place largely during sleep. During sleep, we clear out short-term memory. It's wasteful. It uses up memory space. And especially it uses up memory space for another kind of memory, which is called executive memory. And executive memory is different to short-term and long-term. It's not stored at all, excepting for the period that it is strictly useful. You put a cup down next to you on the table. You have two sorts of memory. You can recall the next day, probably, that the cup was there, or in a couple of hours. But when you want to sip, you unconsciously reach out and pick it up because your brain has executive memory, which allows it to reach to that cup. It's also executive memory. It tells you that that is the cup and that inside that cup is water or whatever. But we are more interested in short-term and long-term because you, as students, of course, you're continually trying to get short-term memory and convert it to long-term memory. You do that by repetition. And you do that also, by the way, by making sure that you sleep properly. Because if you don't sleep properly, you're not going to form memory properly. So a lot of what we've learned about memory has come from this gentleman. His name was Henry Molaison, and he was always known as HM. And he was very, very famous because when he was a young man, or since he was a child, he'd had epilepsy, and it did not respond to any drugs or anything. It got worse and worse and worse and worse. They determined that the source of the epilepsy was somewhere near his limbic system. And he underwent, so it was in the Diencephalon somewhere. He underwent an operation where they excised most of his hippocampus. In fact, they found that much of his hippocampus had already begun to degenerate. And they removed parts of his amygdala and various other parts of the brain. He recovered perfectly well, was physically extremely well, but was utterly unable to form long-term memory. In fact, even his short-term memory was extremely short. It was a matter of minutes before he forgot what he'd done minutes before. But this was one of the instances where they realized this profound difference between short and long-term memory. Because he had long-term memory. He could remember things from before the operation. Not only that, he could modify long-term memory. For example, he remembered that he had lived through a polio epidemic. And then they told him that these polio epidemics didn't happen anymore because there was a vaccine for polio. And he was able to remember that there was a vaccine for polio because he modified a memory he already had. But he couldn't, if you had simply told him about a vaccine, he wouldn't have remembered. So it was also clear that he had lost much of his emotional affect. He was basically pretty emotionless. People who suffer these major memory deficits, it happens to other people as well, where their hippocampus is damaged and their amygdala is not damaged. They suffer agonizing emotional consequences of their inability to remember. So this was HM, and he was another of the people who suffered a brain lesion, who taught us a lot about memory and everything else. Okay, so I know that it's been over time, and I apologize, but I wanted to get this section finished today. And then next time, our next class tomorrow, we will be moving on to study plants in American.